Welcome to The Writer's Dream, a show about books and authors. You can find us on Facebook. Our page is called The Writer's Dream. You can also find us here at ltveh.org. Just look for video on demand and wend your way through the computer commands and you will find The Writer's Dream and you can see our show. We're also on YouTube. You have to look for my channel. I'm Linda Maria Frank, and I am the author of Annie Tillery Mysteries. Just put in my name, the full name, and click on my picture, and you'll come up with about, I would say, 150 to 200 interviews with authors. So if you're interested in reading and writing, finding some good books, especially local authors on Long Island, please visit YouTube. Today's guest is Talia Carner. And Talia is a repeat visitor. She has written 4 books now?
5.
5 books now. And the thing about Talia that I really want to focus on is Talia has such an interesting background, and that interesting background really has influenced the books that she's written, which deal with topics that are very timely today, probably timely in the history of mankind. And her early career, she's always been involved in supporting women. First, it was in marketing, yes? Magazines, women's magazines, getting women to collaborate, and you were describing to me what you did with a group of women as really a marketing block, right? Mm-hmm. And giving women strength. And also, what I found very interesting is that you got the White House Oversight Commission to change a law. Talk about that.
Yeah, at the time in the early 90s when women began, first of all, let me say thank you for having me on your show.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Talia, always.
But back to the question, in the early 90s, women began to enter into the entrepreneurial venture type of businesses rather than just being employees in somebody else's work. And there were several reasons for it. But what was interesting in that phenomena was that until then, the Office of Labor Statistics considered husband-wife's business as owned by men. And it was not listed as half and half. So we did not have, until then, a huge proportion of partnerships between husband and wives giving any credit to women whatsoever. My study, which I conducted with an independent company, showed the percentage of husband-wives partnerships that were not being accounted. So I made it public, and the White House at that time assigned an oversight committee to look into it, and they changed the way husband-wives businesses were being listed. It also was important because if the women were really very active, and they defined it at the time as at least 30 hours a week, they could apply to different grants and apply to contracts that for women-owned businesses. Which
banks.
Yes.
Banks.
Banks were changing. So this was just the beginning, and by giving women back the power that they already were having was a very important step.
Sure, well...
And we say, oh, so many women jumped between 90s, I believe, 4 and 6, so many women started their own businesses. Now, yes, they did, but it was also the way they were accounted.
Mm-hmm. But also, I think, probably economically speaking, the banks are looking at labor statistics and they're seeing that, oh, women are starting businesses, women are starting successful businesses or are involved in. Maybe we need to pay attention to women when they apply for loans. Because I have a little story about that. I went to Europe the first time in 1979, and I had a credit card in my husband's name. And I was running out of money at the end of the trip, and so I tried to go to an American Express office, and no, it was Visa, and get money. They wouldn't give it to me unless I got my husband's approval.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh, this has got to go. I have to get my own card.
Yeah. So that is just part of the economic situation of women. There are so many other women's issues, or issues that women affect
Yes.
women in a greater way than it affects men. And therefore, I've been focusing in my writing, once I began I started to write fiction, I have been focusing on their issues.
And rightly so. And I mean, you've also been involved in bringing justice for women in Africa and India, to the terrible practices of genital mutilation and burning of widows and
brides.
It's
And
really
burning of brides is different. The burning of widows is another tragedy. Burning of brides is fights among families over dowry. And the fights don't stop, and miraculously those Indian women catch fires in the kitchen and they get killed. So this brings me into the much larger picture of violence against women.
Yeah.
And sexual violence against women is part of it, obviously, because even in the case of dowry, as fights erupt, or the case of Africa, the genital mutilation of 80 million women, this is all part of a sexual subjugation of women. And the big part that we are facing everywhere around the globe and in our own backyard, in whatever neighborhood you are in the United States, is sex trafficking, which is a form of human slavery.
Yes.
And it is.
Yes.
And it is. The other part of human slavery is labor, but I just cannot focus on everything at one time, so I break it down to bite-size, almost bite-size. It's still a very huge field.
And it's perfect for you because of the way that the way your career has developed, and you've been this champion for women. I mean, you attended the 1995 Women's Conference in Beijing. That was the one where Hillary Clinton made that famous "Women's rights are human rights."
Yeah, I don't even want to get into
I don't
that
expect
situation.
You to, but that was the same one, wasn't it?
It was really only 300 people were allowed into that.
Wow.
That presentation, and so it's
yeah.
It was something that was done for her publicity in the United States, and I, as someone who stood there under the thousands of umbrellas because it was pouring rain, we all felt very slighted by her. So we felt that it was a publicity stunt. You stand there under an umbrella in pouring rain, thousands of women.
Yeah.
They wanted to get in,
but women have really.
So the 300 seats were given to the media, by the way.
Ah, well. But women have really taken, I think, inspiration from all of these steps. Look at the Women's March after, in, what was it, 2017.
Yeah.
It was huge worldwide, and marches are becoming more and more popular. But
and that's another problem, is that we need a more unified voice, because women have a lot of reasons for grievances on every single front. But as the Women's March, for example, I would have liked to see a unified front as to the one big issue. And again, for me, violence against women in all forms is very important. And that takes me from the beginning of my first novel, Puppet Child, which is about the way judges put molested children in the hands of their molesters. And when we they refuse to believe that there is molestation, basically. That's why they do it. Say that the mothers invented.
Well, women are not listened to. Nor
Right,
children.
and they're discredited, disenfranchised. And that novel, Puppet Child, by the way, is set in Long Island, and I researched it in Nassau County Court. But the problem with that is once the children are being put in the hands of their molesters or taken away from a good enough mothers, good enough is what Phyllis Chesler called it. They're good enough. None of us is perfect, but definitely good enough. And put into foster care. And if you look at trafficking, sex trafficking that is of people who are born in the United States, about a third of sex trafficking is born in the United States. People are born here, and 2/3 are imported. You find that the majority have had sexual molestation and rape as children, and in the foster care system is a pipeline directly into prostitution. So we as a society are failing. And I came into that subject completely by way about when I decided to write The Third Daughter, which is set in the late 1800s in Buenos Aires.
Yes, tell us about the book, because that is our point of interest here.
So many of us know the story of Fiddler on the Roof.
Yes.
They've seen the movies, the plays, school plays. It's been doing fabulously well. When Tevye and his wife and 2 unmarried daughters leave the stage, what happens? I happened to come across a short story in the same short story collection by the Yiddish storyteller Sholem Aleichem. And that short story is called The Men from Buenos Aires. And it appears in the same short story collection. So I said, what happens when they leave the stage? And that is regarding the adaptation, the theatrical adaptation, because in the very first short story, it's actually, Tevye says he has 7 daughters. Then he says he has 6. Then he tells the story about 5 of them. In the adaptation of Fiddler on the Roof, only the stories of 3 exist and 2 are girls on stage. So I eventually cut all the extra superfluous sisters, and that's why it's called The Third Daughter. I didn't need more than 2 ahead of my protagonist, but they leave the stage during a pogrom, and they meet the men from Buenos Aires. They are in such dire situation, left their home, were thrown away. The pogroms in Eastern Europe were extremely bloody, extremely difficult for the Jews. It's not as well known in some circles because the Holocaust, unfortunately, paled all of those 400 years of the Tsar edicts and state-initiated pogroms on the Jews. But when they meet a man who is well-heeled, wealthy, who offers that next daughter marriage and taking her to America, Jews at that time, this is late 1800s. They didn't know from North America, South America. They heard America, and yes, he promised, he looked fabulous, and they let her go with him, not realizing that as soon as she gets on a boat, already she's being groomed into becoming a prostitute by repeated rape, tortured, caged, starvation, which turns out, my research showed, was a method that was being used by a legal union of traffickers called Zvi Migdal, ZWI-MIGDAL. Again, not very known, but they victimized a huge number of women. And it was legal in South America, in Argentina, in Brazil, in Montevideo, Uruguay. Christian countries, governments, believed that prostitution was quote, good, safe, and protected good women and families. Therefore, they encouraged prostitution. And even in Brazil, the Jesuits wrote to the Queen in Portugal asking to send more prostitutes. The government of Argentina, 25% of its budget, and at that time it was one of the fastest growing economies in the world in the early 1900s, 25% of the government's budget came from brothels. So enslavement of women was legal, and I'm talking enslavement the way prior to that in the United States, the whites owned blacks. So if a black slave fled and ran to the police would bring him or her back. Mm-hmm. The same thing was happening with what's called now white slavery, and those were women lured from Eastern Europe to South America under false pretense and forced into prostitution. Now, as a novel, I dealt with the moral dilemma. What does she do? Is she going to commit suicide? Or is she going to try to keep her promise to her family to bring them to America as they understood? And that meant accepting what has happened to her. Could never tell them the truth, could never tell Tevye what happened to her. He was too good a man. And when you start reading my book, the first couple of chapters are available on my website. You get a sense of him before all of this bad stuff happening. But there are points of light in the novel because you can't, as dark as it is, and it was a dark journey for me. Oh. But there are points of light. There's the tango, which was just developing at that time in the brothels of South America, of Buenos Aires specifically. And the friendships among the prostitutes, they call each other sisters. They become the new family where they all have lost everything they've had before. And then, of course, at the very end, I'm not going to give the ending, but her relationship also with some of her clients, she's fond of some of her clients, they're fond of her, they develop some relationships and appreciation, and she has a huge challenge that she takes upon herself to bring down this prostitution ring. And at the end, the novel is redemptive.
Good. But this is a practice that goes on everywhere.
Right, and today very little has changed in the methods traffickers use.
Yes.
They continue to lure women, and mostly women. There are also boys and also trans, but the vast majority are women. And they continue to lure them from Eastern Europe, from Southeast Asia, with promises of jobs usually now.
Jobs, yeah.
And once they get them, they take their passports away, they make all kinds of threats. They threaten their families. If you try to run away, or if you do XYZ, or if you don't do what we tell you to do, your mother is going to be killed, the child you left is going to be found some terrible ending, going to be maimed. They show them photographs of boys that had their eyes cut out. This is what you want to happen to your boy? Yeah. So it's awful. It's awful what they do. And usually all these people come to the States, let's say if they enter legally, because they do get visas very often. They don't speak the language. They don't know the laws. They do not know that there are services available. They think the police is the same as the police in their country of origin, which tends to be very corrupt and definitely not helpful. So they believe that there is no place for them to go. And this is where the listeners and viewers tonight can do something about it, because there are organizations, and I'm in touch with about 20 of them, but they are personally, but there are dozens of them right listed on my website under a page called What Can You Do? Call for action.
What is your website?
It's my website is my name, www.
And it's TALIACARNER.
Correct.com, and under there you can find that information. In every community, you can take action, and you can take action for people who are U.S. born. Women in prison, for example, may be incarcerated on a whole bunch of reasons, not necessarily for prostitution. Prostitution, they get released overnight.
Yeah, it's good for business.
Well, actually, it's better if they start arresting the Johns, because the Johns are the ones who perpetuate the crime.
Well, I think really with prostitution, with white slavery, the approach to helping to get rid of it has to be to expose the people who are making the money, who are propagating it, and for organizations to put the pressure on the media. And I think this is, for instance, this book is very important because it exposes, I think, fiction, because people love to read fiction and to read these stories where people are suffering. Let's put it quite bluntly. But I think that it serves a purpose because it's a compelling story that brings to light something that people may in the background know about, but they really don't understand the full implication of it. So this is important. Would be great if it was made into a movie. The movie that comes to mind is Eastern Promises, and I think in terms of the Russians and the white slavery that they were supporting, and also to point out that it's a lot of this is, of course, motivated by one thing, and that's money. And
let me expand a little bit on that particular paradigm where in economic format we have the supply, the suppliers, and the demand. The supply is going to be inexhaustible as long as there is misery and strife and wars around the world, and you have people wanting to come, as well as within the United States. You have our systems I mentioned before fail children and youngsters who are in need. The procurers are the suppliers, the pimps. As long as the profits are so huge and the punishment is light, they stand to profit and take the little risk. The most vulnerable part here is the demand side. No man wants to be exposed. He doesn't want to be fired for having used corporate computer to purchase sex, or the truck, or during a conference away he gets involved. Companies now have, many of those companies have protocol in place and in the manual of the behavior of their employees. So it is now, if you have victims, you have victimizers. And in the act are the men who buy sex. And until we understand them and look at them as the perpetrators who create the demand, then we don't deal with the problem. So by lowering the demand, and doing that is through education. If they begin to understand the men, and again I have to say it's men, I'm not against men, I'm married for 40 years with a wonderful guy.
But facts are facts.
Yeah, but that's the industry we are talking about.
Yes.
As long as they don't understand that they are dealing with victims, where the profits go to a third party, so regardless of how these women behave and solicit and dress, the fact is someone else owns them. Somebody else makes the money. And when the buyers of sex services begin to understand that the women they are buying for whatever transient 5 minutes or an evening are enslaved to someone else and they are victims, this is where the education begins. to come in. And that's when we lower the demand.
And also, what you said originally was no man really wants his name associated with being with a prostitute. For a while there, newspapers were actually publishing the names of the Johns. And I don't know what the long-term effect was, but...
It's definitely, it's never a good news to anybody. But that, what I'm saying is not just the threat of exposure, which is definitely very important, but understanding why what you do is wrong and why you now the criminal and not the prostitute.
Yes.
When they begin to understand that, then we are dealing with a lot more compassion. And that's, I think, what the third daughter does. What a reader comes out of reading this novel is understanding the humanity of Batya, the protagonist, who had been kidnapped at 14, no different from any other teenagers who are now prostituting. And she keeps her personality, she keeps her faith, she keeps her religion, she keeps her inside. She finds ways to separate herself from what is happening to her and to her body, and eventually we get to care about her. What readers tell me is they keep on thinking about her a day or two later after the book ends, and that's a great feeling, isn't
Absolutely.
it? When you have this great reading experience where something stays with you, and that is the humanity that I like my readers to take from the
And I
book.
think they take that from all of your books. So we have a few seconds left. The Third Daughter by Talia Carner. And this was a very interesting and informative interview, and I hope people read it and learn from it, and your website as well.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Talia.
Thanks a lot.